Good afternoon, everybody online. Warm welcome to this webinar. My name is Ingrid Klingmann. I'm the chairwoman of EFGZP, and I'm going to chair this webinar today, and hope that I will want to give chance to a few more people to join, because I see that ongoingly attendees are joining. So let's wait one more minute and then we start. So I think I'm going to start. So also welcome to those who have now newly joined. This is Ingrid Klingmann speaking, and I would like to facilitate this webinar today, moderate this webinar today, when we are going to talk about the fourth of the guidelines for patient engagement that EUPATI developed while we were still a EUPATI IMI project. So we developed these guidelines around this time last year. The first guidance, or the three guidances that we have already presented and discussed here, were guidance about patient engagement for the collaboration with pharmaceutical industry, patient involvement in the ethical review in ethics committees, and patient engagement in collaboration with regulatory authorities. And this one here is now about the engagement and interaction with HTA agencies and HTA activities. It is my great pleasure to present to you as the key author of this guidance and presenter of today's presentation, Dr. Amy Hunter. Amy is the Director of Research at Genetic Alliance in the UK. She has a PhD in molecular biology, and she has worked in several settings, all related to biomedical research, the biomedical world altogether. Most recently, she held posts at RNID, that's a UK charity for deaf and hard of hearing people, and University College London. She is British, and she is, as I said, now the Director of Research at Genetic Alliance UK, where she oversees, in fact, the research activities of this organization to support the aims of that charity. Genetic Alliance UK is an umbrella organization with over 190 patient group members, which aims to provide information, to provide families, and to influence or to support families and to influence the services needed by patients with Genetic Alliance. Genetic Alliance UK is also a member of the European Genetic Alliances network, EGAN. Amy will present an introduction and then also go with you through the guidance step by step, and at all times in that presentation and going through, there are possibilities to ask questions. You have a question box in on your screen where you can enter your questions all through the presentations, and I will, as soon as the respective topic comes up, I will raise these questions either to Amy or to one of our two panelists. And one panelist is Dominic Hammerlenk. Dominic has been a patient advocate at the Dutch and European Lung Patients Organization since 15 years. She was involved in several European research projects and the development of guidance and standards of care. In parallel, she's a member of ISPOR Patients Roundtable and has been working with health economists in several projects. Dominic owns her own business as a change management and project manager, and very often advises on improving the involvement of people. The second panelist is Lizzie Thomas. Lizzie has worked at NICE, which is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, already since 2004. She is a senior public involvement advisor in the Public Involvement Program, or PIP, the team at NICE, which is dedicated to patient or citizen involvement. She is responsible for the strategic development of patient and public involvement in all of the HTA work programs at NICE. For example, technology appraisals, interventional procedures, medical technologies and diagnostics, scientific advice. And she also represents both PIP and NICE on national and international committees, including the steering group at the HTA Patient Citizen Involvement Interest Group. She completed her Master in Public Services Policy and Management at King's College and has a BA in Biological Sciences from the University of Oxford. So these are the two panelists, and we all together will hopefully make this a very lively webinar based, of course, on your questions. We will try to answer as many of your questions as possible, so please don't feel shy and just write down your questions. We will manage then the discussions during the 90 minutes that we have. So with this, I would like to hand over to Amy. So Amy, if you want to start your presentation, and please, audience, feel free to raise your questions in the question box.
Okay, thanks very much, Ingrid. Can the panel at least see my screen so I know that that is working?
It works, yes.
Great. Okay, so thanks, Ingrid, for that clear introduction. I'm Amy Hunter, and as Ingrid said, I work for Genetic Alliance UK, which is a charity representing people with genetic and rare diseases in the UK. We were part of the EUPATI project through our membership of the European patient organisation EGAN. And one of our activities within EUPATI was to draw together this guidance document on patient involvement in HTA. I'll spend about 5 to 10 minutes going through a few slides about the guidance document first. I'll talk first about the need for the guidance documents, and then I'll outline the process that we followed to pull them together. And then I'll focus specifically on the scope and the content of the HTA guidance, and then I'll have a bit of a look at what are the key points within each section of that guidance, and at that point I'll switch from the PowerPoint presentation to the guidance document itself. I will show that on the screen, the PDF, but hopefully people listening in and watching the webinar will also have a copy if that's easier for you to refer to as I go through it. And as Ingrid said, if you have any questions, you can type those in, and Ingrid will direct those to either myself or to people on the panel. So historically, in the early stages of medicine's development, obviously patients have always been involved as participants in clinical trials, but I think it's been accepted for quite a long time that there's a need to have patients and patient organisations involved throughout the life cycle of medicine's development. Progress has been patchy, depending on the country, depending on the stage of medicine's development that we're talking about. And this is one of the things that we wanted to try and address through developing the guidances. So at the beginning of each of the guidance documents, the 4 guidance documents, we have an overarching principles section, which I will show you when I go onto the document. But it sets out and establishes the need for this expansion of meaningful interaction across the life cycle of medicine's development. And it talks about the existing landscape in terms of existing codes of practice and how they don't yet pull together all the different sources that are already available, and that there are still gaps actually in our knowledge in terms of understanding how interaction, how involvement can work effectively at different stages of developing medicines. Specifically for HTA, you may have heard of the UNETA HTA core model, which I think is on its 3rd iteration. I may be wrong with that. That's an enormous collaborative European piece of work which tries to build a very detailed framework for how HTA should be carried out, but it's very technical. So where it talks about patients, they're seen as sources of evidence. So for example, through qualitative or mixed method studies to capture patient perspective on specific questions, rather than people who can bring a specific insight to the process of HTA. And what I mean by that is that patients can bring something different. They can bring a perspective on what it's like to live with their condition and what it might be like to have certain kinds of treatment, which is useful context when HTA committees are trying to assess clinical data. Patients can challenge assumptions that other people may have about what their aspirations are for their health. So, for example, a nice example is an HTA process looking at enabling home dialysis for kidney patients. The challenge from patients was that actually, for a lot of them, home dialysis was not something that they would greatly value, because that would essentially medicalize their home. And what they wanted was a better and more efficient service of dialysis, but in the hospital setting. So that's just a nice example about challenging assumptions that people who aren't patients might have. Also, patients can obviously advise about whether trial outcomes, clinical trial outcomes, excuse me, are actually relevant to them. Or they may be relevant but not terribly important. There may be more important things to measure. So if those are the kinds of things we're looking for when we're talking about good patient involvement, there are already several sources of recommendations and good practice. So for the HTA guidance document, we didn't do any primary data collection. It was very much a case of looking at those good sources that were already out there, trying to pull together the key messages from those documents into a short guidance framework that would be useful to both HTA bodies and to patients and patient organisations who wanted to get involved. So the key documents have been published by, for example, HTA, who did a very large international consensus building exercise, which I'll come on to in a little bit more detail later. The European Patients Forum, which is obviously the European Patient Organisation, they carried out surveys of patients and HTA bodies about how this could work. And obviously a few different national HTA bodies publish descriptions of what they do. They publish useful templates, for example, for patients to give written submissions. There's a whole range of different resources out there, and what we've done is try to draw them together in a sensible way. The other problem in patient involvement in HTA is the massive variation in practice between member states. So some countries have quite a mature system that's constantly evolving, and that evolution itself involves patients and their views. In other countries, there's really no patient involvement, or in the middle it might exist, but it might be quite restricted. So in some countries, patient involvement is limited to people who work for patient organisations. The patient organisation may have to be on a registered list. Involvement may be limited to written submissions, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of variation. There's certainly no European legislation to try and force the situation to change. So it was felt that it's quite important to make this clear statement that collaboration is important and valuable not only to the patients, but as I described a bit earlier, it brings value to the process as well. So the HTA guidance document is one of 4, as Ingrid has already explained. The other 3, for which there have already been webinars, are the industry-led research and development document, the regulatory processes document, and the ethics committees document. And in all cases, there was an extensive process of consultation, both internally within EUPATI, developing early drafts and getting the technical content correct. But then also there was an external public consultation, which you as listeners to the webinar may have contributed to before they were published in December last year. So hopefully you will have access to the document itself, as I said, when we get to it, but this slide just reminds you where to go if you want to download your own PDF. If you go to the EUPATI website, click on the resources menu and then guidances, and you'll come up with all 4 guidances from there. So I've already touched on the general need for improving patients' involvement across the life cycle of medicine's development. Sorry, I think I've gone page up instead of down. Oh, I had a double slide, apologies. I wanted to actually talk about the process that we followed in developing this HTA document. So I mentioned that for HTA, possibly more so than the other documents, there was quite a rich pool of resources out there already, and these were the key ones. The HTA values and quality standards document came out of a consensus building exercise. They consulted with patients and academics, with HTA bodies and with industry to find out what it was that patients wanted to bring and could bring, and what it would be useful for them to bring to the process of HTA. And it was an iterative process, so it was a very in-depth consultation, and that, I think, is the key thing that our guidance is built upon, because that, because of the process they followed, has a really good validity. Also, I mentioned the EPF survey of patient organisations and HTA bodies. So again, that was surveying people in different countries across Europe. I should say the HTA exercise was international, it went beyond Europe. So the EPF surveys secured input from both patient organisations and from HTA bodies as well. And as I said also, there are lots of resources out there from HTA and from a lot of the national bodies in Europe covering their ideas on how things can be done, but also useful tools, so templates that patients can use to give written submissions and similar tools like that. And there's quite a body of published literature around this area as well. So those are the things that we drew on to develop the core text of this document. We had support in terms of technical oversight from Karen Facey, who led the values and quality standards work, and other colleagues at HTA. EPF were kind enough to input to the first draft as well, as were Victoria Thomas and Lizzie Amis from NICE. So when that first draft was ready, then it went out to internal review. So just to reiterate, we didn't do any primary data generating for this particular guidance. So the first draft went out to internal review by all the EUPATI partners, which hopefully you'll know includes both patient organisations and industry, and does also include HTA bodies. Once that review was completed and the draft revived, then we went out to the public consultation, which was all 4 documents together. And again, for HTA, we did receive input from patient organisations, from industry, and from HTA bodies. So just briefly to have a look at what the scope of the document is before I pull the document up on the screen. I thought it was worth just commenting on the term patient. There are lots of different related terms: patient, patient expert, patient representative, which people may have slightly different understandings of. All those definitions, well, EUPATI went through a process of consultation and came up with a list of consensus definitions for several different phrases, and that is included in the document. For HTA, we have just used the term patient to cover all of those, except where there's a particular reason to refer to, for example, a patient representative or a patient organisation, as opposed to an individual. A lot of the ways that patients can be involved in HTA, the guidance and the way it can be done apply equally to these different categories or subcategories of patient. Also to mention that, of course, HTA is carried out for not just for medicines but for other interventions such as medical devices, because the scope of EUPATI is medicines. Hence, the scope of this document also is just looking at medicines and not other things such as medical devices. And also to reiterate the message that this is about participation, patient participation in the HTA process. Is not about the scientific collection of patient perspective. So first of all, the document looks at the high-level values, and they really arise from the HTA work. And then it goes on to more specific suggestions as to how these can be upheld. And those suggestions can really be broken down also into two levels. First of all, the high-level strategies, policies that organisations could adopt. So that's patient organisations and HTA bodies. And then there is a list of more specific activities. Those are suggestions, and they can be adopted and adapted as different patient organisations and HTA bodies see fit. So this is not supposed to be a prescriptive final list. It's supposed to be a list of suggestions that we think are good practice and that will be useful if adopted to improve patient involvement. And at the end of the document, the resources that I've mentioned that we use to develop the main text, and also templates and so on that can be downloaded, they're listed as well in the document. So if I just pull up, this is the PDF. If you download the PDF, the one thing you get, which you don't get if you're reading it on screen, is page numbers. So that will be quite helpful. I'll be referring to page numbers as I go through this document. So just in case you're looking for page numbers and can't find them, that might be why. So this is the first page, and as I said, there's this overarching principles text, which is common to all four documents, all four guidance documents. It talks about the need to improve patient involvement, and it talks about the existing landscape in terms of gaps in guidance. And at the bottom of the page is a description of the scope for this particular guidance, which I've already been through in my slides. So I'll move on. This graphic rather is quite, it's a nice useful one that EUPATI uses a lot. It's a nice sort of one-stop shop overview of the life cycle of medicines R&D and where and how patients can be involved. It's a nice summary. Towards the bottom of page 2, the rationale for the guidance. This is where we get into some new material that I haven't covered in the slides so much. So there's a little bit of setting the scene. What is health technology assessment? Not a lot of detail, obviously, but just to remind people that health technology assessment is applied to medicines which already have a license, but it's a process that assesses those medicines in order for a national body to decide if it should be funded through their own national health service. So HTA will look at clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and wider social and ethical impacts on the healthcare system and on lives of individual patients. This is me banging the drum again, but the final paragraph on this page, again, is talking about what patients, in a nutshell, can bring to this process, that they provide information and insight, and this is different to evidence.
Amy, this is Ingrid. May I interrupt you here for a minute?
Sure.
Because a couple of questions, and I think the first one you answered already, but perhaps you could explain it again just to make sure that we have all the same understanding. The first question is, what really does HTA stand for? And perhaps you could also then explain what HTAI stands for.
Yeah, I'm really sorry I went over that without explaining. So HTA stands for Health Technology Assessment. And as I said, what that means is that once a medicine has completed its clinical trials and it's been given a license, so the license means that the manufacturer, the developer, is legally allowed to sell its new medicine, then countries such as the UK, for example, which has a national health service, has to then decide, make its own decision whether to fund that medicine under its own system. And this is where HTA comes in. So they have their own process, the national body, which for England is called NICE. They have their own process for assessing the effectiveness of the medicine and making the decision as to whether to fund it or not. Then I think the next question, what is HTA? HTA is an international organisation that works to, I don't have their mission statement, I'm afraid, at the front of my mind, but they work to improve the way HTA is carried out globally, and one of their interests, it's not their sole interest, but one of their subgroups works specifically on improving patient involvement, and that's why they carried out this consensus building exercise as to what values should underpin patient involvement in HTA.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that makes it a clear basis for what we are talking about. There are more general questions then about the HTA systems in Europe, but I think we come to that later. So why don't you continue then with your going through the document?
Okay. The introduction text really is ideas that I covered in the presentation. So one of the key messages is that there isn't European legislation around this issue, which means that practice in different countries varies hugely. HTA processes can be run nationally. In some cases, they are run regionally, just depending on the setup in the country, in each country. So there's an awful lot of variation. Excuse me. So the objectives of the guidance, which are on the screen now, I guess the main objective actually is to try and pull together what good evidence is out there already about how patient involvement can work effectively in HTA. The table that is shown there has 5 different values listed and explained, and they arise directly from the HTA consensus building exercise. So the exercise had input from about 150 respondents based in 39 countries, and they had the chance to input to each stage of development of the values. So it was very consultative, and I think it has, as I said, great validity. So the values that the exercise proposes as being important when you're considering patient involvement in HTA are these. So relevance, which means that the information, the perspective that patients can give is relevant, and it can't really be got anywhere else. Secondly, fairness. Patients have rights to contribute to the HTA process because they are key stakeholders. Thirdly, equity. It's important that HTA processes don't just assess the needs and look at the needs of the health service in question, but also those of the patients themselves. The fourth one is legitimacy, and that is the idea that good patient involvement increases the legitimacy of the process. It makes it more transparent and more accountable, and therefore hopefully more credible as well. And the final point is about capacity building. So the more patients are supported to get involved in a sensible and effective way, the better they will become at doing that, and the better the partnerships will be between patients and HTA organisations. So as I said, those are the sort of the bedrock values behind this document, and they come out of the HTA process. So we're on page 3. The content on page 3, 4 and 5 get down into making specific positive suggestions. So this section on page 3, suggested working practices, is starting to look at organisational level policies that could be followed. And I'm going to be quite careful how I explain each section, just because in this format, the PDF, but also I think when you start to scroll through the web version of the file, there are the subheadings don't have numbers, so it's a little bit difficult to tell what's a subheading and what's a subheading. So bear with me, I'll try and keep it clear as we go through it. So this section, Suggested Working Practices, it's aimed at both HTA agencies and patient organisations. And you can see that there are two parts. So this first part is aimed at HTA bodies. And as I said, this is quite high-level policy ideas that hopefully bodies will be able to adopt. So the first couple are very important, I think. Basically, that HTA bodies should have a strategy that outlines the processes and responsibilities for patient involvement. It sounds obvious, but I think unless you start from that position, then you're not going to be very effective at introducing this kind of new activity. The second one is that appropriate resources, so both financial and staff and time, need to be committed to make this work properly. I'm not going to go through every single bullet point, but just to pull out a couple more, which I think just seem to me to be worth highlighting, is this one. It's important, I think, to make sure that everyone understands what are the objectives of patient input. People will put in a lot of time and effort when asked to contribute to this kind of process, and it's really important that everyone knows exactly what it is being asked of them and what the ultimate aim is, so that the whole process can work effectively. And on the basis that success breeds success, once this kind of thing starts to be introduced as a new thing by HTA bodies, then hopefully the practice will grow and will become central to the organisation. Especially for small patient organisations, it's really important that there are clear timelines established. It's obviously just an efficiency thing. The patient input needs to be, the HTA body needs to know exactly what format it's going to come in, and it needs to be systematically incorporated into their assessment. Again, these might seem fairly obvious, but I think it's really important that they're highlighted and they're down in black and white as things to consider. So the bottom part of this section then turns to look at some policies that it would be useful for patient organisations to focus on. There are a few of these, so I'll just mention them each. The first one is about being trained in the nature of HTA. It can seem a bit off-putting and technical and difficult, but it's not really. And as long as with some support and training, it's perfectly possible for patients to go in without any scientific background, without any medical background, to go in and give their valuable insights to the process. If at all possible, it's good for patient organisations to approach their local HTA agencies themselves and try to kickstart a conversation about how involvement might happen. The third one, understanding HTA processes, I guess that's similar, that's related to being trained, so just to try and understand what the process is that you're getting involved with. And to collaborate with other patient organisations, even organisations working with very different conditions will have, if they've been involved in HTA, will likely have useful experiences to share with you. And if there are patient organisations working in similar fields, it may be that you can collaborate on giving input to specific HTA processes for specific medicines, depending on the medicine. And this obviously is good practice for patient organisations in whatever activities they are taking part in to remain transparent. Certainly in the UK recently, a lot of charities have come under a lot of, they've been running into difficulties, and there's been a lot of scrutiny about how transparent they are, how they raise their funding, and so on. So it's important to remain transparent. So just to come back to the issue of what's a subheading and sub-subheading, this is moving on from the policy level now. So the next couple of pages are looking at rather more specific lower level suggested activities rather than policies for organisations. The first bit is titled General HTA Process. So that's rather than looking at an individual process that an individual medicine is going to go through, this is looking at how to make the process of patient involvement easy and smooth. And it talks about outreach and education, so there are specific suggestions around guidance materials, having a single point of contact at the HTA body for patient involvement issues, excuse me, providing glossaries, and how to advertise forthcoming HTA processes for specific medicine. There's a lot that HTA bodies can do in a wider sense. So if, for example, the process that HTA is carried out is going to be changed, then patients can be included on that as consultees. They may have suggestions as to how their involvement could be improved or changed. This is getting a little bit more progressive, I think. There are different approaches to securing the views of people who don't have the scientific and medical background and yet securing their views on complex technical issues. So the suggestion of using a citizens' jury is interesting. Again, it's just a suggestion. Citizens' jury is a format where 12 lay people form the jury, and they have access to a series of experts over a series of days, and they can ask questions of those experts, and it's a way of helping them come to a view on a technical matter. That's very intensive, but the thinking around different ways to capture patient views, I think, is very important. And the final point is to look at permanent membership of HTA committees. So HTA committees quite often already have what are called lay members, but they could be just members of the public without a technical background. And the proposal here is that patients could be included within that lay membership. So that's the general HTA process section. Now this is the next section, individual HTAs. So now the document turns to look at, okay, you've got a medicine is going to go through the HTA process. What specifically could we do to get patient input? So the rest of this page is talking about this issue. And these sections are basically following the HTA process in a chronological way. So first of all, identifying which, I've used the word technologies, which is the HTA term, but obviously what we're talking about here is medicines. So identifying and prioritizing which medicines are going to go through the HTA process. Patients can be involved here. Then there's the scoping or developing the framework for that individual HTA process. Again, patients can be involved in this stage. Then the meaty one, which I think is probably what we all assume when we first think about patients being involved in HTA, is the actual assessment and developing of recommendations and guidelines. There are lots of different ways that patients can be involved in this section. And again, obviously we're talking about individual patients, patient organisations, and a few of them are highlighted here. Probably these are the key ones. But the HTA bodies need to be proactive, so I'm using the word invite quite a lot. So patient organisations can be invited to nominate their own experts to attend meetings. They can be invited to give written submissions from individuals. And there are lots of practical things that can be done to help this kind of process happen. So provision of templates and guidance documents, and telephone support for those who are going to give written submissions to an HTA process. And the final, oh sorry, this, just before I move on, this is a very interesting one as well. This is to try and capture at the end of the assessment how the experience was for the patients attending the meeting. I think it's important to do this very soon after the meeting, if at all possible, so that people's reflections are fresh, and that can then be fed directly into an overall review of patient involvement. And the final thing is, the final part of the process is reviewing the recommendations that have been made and then disseminating the outcomes. Patient groups especially can be particularly important when it comes to helping disseminate the outcomes, obviously. But there's quite a lot that HTA bodies can do to make sure that patients and stakeholders have access themselves. So from, excuse me, from summarising what the patient input was and how it was used, and providing lay language versions of HTA documents is really key.
Okay, Amy, before you move now to conditions, I think we have a number of questions for the HTA process, and perhaps we can focus on those first. There is one question about what are or in which countries do we have HTA processes? Is that in every European country a formal part of the healthcare system, or is that different in different countries? That is perhaps a question to Lizzie. You are from NICE, but do you know about other organizations in Europe that are doing similar type of work?
Hi everyone. So it varies a lot, and one of the benefits of having international collaborations is exactly so we can share and encourage other systems who are either just starting or is developing their systems. We certainly, when talking about Europe, there's certainly many countries that do have good HTA systems. So France, Spain, Germany, Sweden, Scotland being separate from NICE in England in particular, but lots of other countries are developing their systems and do have systems, but generally those ones I've listed have the best patient and public involvement. But lots of other countries, Denmark, Italy, Poland, all sorts of other countries do have HTA because, as we all know, every country is facing new and expensive drugs and short budgets for healthcare, and so everyone needs to make assessments on those medicines, and it's generally agreed by most systems that HTA is the best and fairest way to do it.
So how people who have not so much experience with this this type of activities and how that practically works, how is that working? Are there governmental committees then in different countries that are requested to look themselves into, let's say, the selection of the drugs or the medical devices that they want to work on, or are there processes that say this is the one that is the most expensive have to be looked at first? How is that working practically? Can you explain that as well?
So I don't know the detail. I'm better at the patient and public involvement in those processes, but it does vary. So sometimes it's a government thing, as you say, so it's the Ministry of Health or something like that that does the assessments. Sometimes some countries do HTA on a regional basis, and so they might get one document that assesses it, but local health systems will then use the technical assessments to make local or regional decisions on reimbursement for those regions. A good example, albeit not Europe, is Canada. So they have their provinces. So the ministry at the middle gives a list, but then each region will take the assessments, the scientific decisions, and use those in terms of reimbursement and which drugs will be paid for on a regional basis. but also HTA can be done at a hospital level as well as national or regional. So sometimes individual health systems or individual hospitals do HTA to decide which medicines or which treatments or which devices and so on will be the best use for that system.
Okay, thank you very much. Dominic, perhaps a question to you. As a patient representative, do you have a bit of overview in which countries patients are involved in the HTA process by definition, for example, or more by chance? Is there any overview about the situation of patients?
Thank you. This is Dominique. There isn't really, because on average, each country has their own rules and regulations and as to where and how patients can be involved. So it might be really, really limited, or it could be from the beginning. And one of the confounding problems as well is that a sort of starting part of the HTA process is started centrally as part of the EMA process, the European Medicine Agency process, before marketing organization, and then parts of that HTA is then used in individual countries. So it is or regions or hospitals. So it is quite difficult to have a view of where patients are involved and how they are involved.
Okay, so there's no, let's say, general approach and probably not much of experience, condensed experience about the best way of involving patients. Amy, you said that in that engagement area, there is no difference between, or you made no difference in your recommendation between the different types of patients. That was differently handled in some other guidances, where the guidances looked very, or made quite clear proposals for which type of patient or patient organization should participate in what activity. Why did you come to the conclusion in that guidance that in fact it does not matter what type of patient is involved in this process?
Well, I think different types of patient can bring very different things. So, for example, someone working for a patient organization may or may not be affected by the condition. So if they are talking about the impact of the condition or a potential treatment on everyday life or the ability to work, their presentation of that information may be rather different to a person who is affected by the condition themselves. I think it's very important there are lots of conditions for whom there is no patient organisation at all, thinking about rare diseases. In the UK, we have quite a mature network of patient organisations generally across all kinds of conditions. But even in the UK, there are many, many rare diseases for whom there's no patient organisation. And I think it's really important that people like that are not excluded from the process. On the other hand, patient organisations can have a very powerful and useful role in coordinating input from individual patients, in establishing relationships in the first place with HTA bodies. So I think what's important is that all bases, a wide variety of voices is captured, and it's probably best for HTA bodies to take this on a case-by-case basis if they are considering what kind of person that they would like to get involved in. Are they talking about their overall organisation of how they run HTA? Are they talking about, okay, we want to look at our templates for written submission? Or are they talking about, okay, who do we get in to give personal testimony at an HTA committee meeting that's looking at a specific medicine? I don't think it's useful for a third party to come in and say, this is the kind of person or organization to give you insight at this point, and then this other kind is useful at this point, because they have different strengths and they can give different kinds of insight.
Okay, so Lizzie, how are you selecting the patients which you are involving in the HTA process in NICE?
So it depends, and as Amy just said, we tailor who we look for the type of involvement or participation that we are doing. So at some stages, say when we're setting the question for the HTA assessment, so that's what we call scoping at the beginning, but at that stage we involve patient organizations. So we ask people to formally represent a charity, and all the relevant charities in that area that we know of that are national for England get invited. However, at another stage, at the committee stage, we ask for individual patients to come and give their personal testimony, and we find those patients by going back to the relevant national charities, the patient organisations, and we ask them to help us find appropriate individual patients or patient advocates or carers, and that depends on the topic. So say we'll have parents for a children's topic, or ideally a patient themselves. And we have 2 people to give personal testimony for every topic. But at other stages, say when we do a consultation on our draft recommendations, that can be everyone. So we ask the patient organizations themselves, we ask the individuals who came and gave testimony, but we also put it on the website and ask if anyone who's not previously involved, so anyone in the public, anyone in the world really, if they want to comment. So we involve different people according to the opportunity available.
Okay, very interesting. That is certainly making a lot of sense for taking into consideration the different types of needs that you have in the different stages of the process. Dominic, from your experience, in what stages have you personally been involved? Where did you see interesting experiences?
That's a bit of a hard question, because I am more involved in trying to move HTA organizations forward in involving patients and trying to figure out how we can practically support patients in doing this. So I don't have my own practical HTA experience yet, and that has to do with that in the Netherlands patients are not involved in HTA. We can only be advisors at certain stages if we are asked. But what I do feel I want to add to what's been said before is that I think I agree that basically people with different experience can be involved in different stages. I would always advocate to involve people who have the condition as much as possible. And I also feel that what is needed is, because HTA asks different questions than usually answered by patient organizations or patient advocates or patient experts, that there should be from the HTA the possibility to support the patients to get that information from their group, because we quite often only have information through surveys that go into specific questions or go into specific experiences and only reach part of the patient group. So I feel that we should be alert, all of us, to also involve the less vocal, less easy to reach patients in the information that gets into the HTA, because that gives the best vision of what is happening for all patients with a specific condition in a specific country or region or hospital.
That sounds pretty difficult to reach sometimes or to achieve. Lizzie, how quickly do patient organizations need to react on such a call? What are the timelines? How can we imagine that?
So one thing that is best practice is for HTA agencies or the people doing HTAs to give as much advance warning of when appropriate topics are coming up. So as soon as we know that NICE is going to do a topic, we will let the appropriate patient organizations for that disease know, and we will let them know when it is likely to happen. So that's often a year in advance because we have a big work program with lots of medicines to look at. So we give them one email which says, in October, your topic will start. And then when we email them again in October, they have, it depends which bit of the topic, but for scoping, for the early stage, it's a 4-week consultation, and then there's a workshop afterwards. When we start the topic properly, they have 8 weeks to complete the evidence submission template to give written evidence from the patient organization point of view, and they have a few months to let us know which individual people, patients or patient advocates or carers, they want to nominate to come to the meeting. And then those people, the sooner we get those people found, the longer they have to prepare to come to the meeting. And the consultation is 4 weeks.
Okay, and after these 4 weeks, they are, so to say, out of the activities, that's it then. So there is no further preparedness or further need to be involved in the process.
We do offer a final stage, which is that patient organizations can appeal our guidance if the final decision is wrong in some way. But hopefully, we hope at NICE that we get patients and patient organizations involved so their views and evidence can be included early, and then hopefully the earlier we get people involved, the better the guidance will be and the less involvement you need in the later stages, because hopefully they've already been involved.
Okay, so that was one of the questions for how long this whole process is going to work. Fine, so I think it's that is excellent. So I think we have a bit clearer picture how that works in practical terms. Now, there was one question on whether and how HTA organizations react on public debate of costs of drugs and or treatments. Is there any mechanism to say, okay, there is such a hot debate now publicly coming up, we need to deal with that right away, or is that not happening? Any idea, Lizzie or Dominic or Amy, have you heard about any such an initiative based on a public debate?
I don't think I could comment, I'm afraid, on that one, Ingrid. Sorry, Lizzie, I'm leaving that with you.
No, that's okay. So we, as I say, we have a very full program of work, and it's planned about a year in advance, because the way that we decide our topics is to try and get the most important drugs to have a decision as close to the date where they get a license from the regulator as possible, because we know that people, as soon as a drug can be used, so it has its license, people want to know whether it should be used. So the most important factor for which topics NICE does and when we do them is when new drugs are going to get their license. When there's a big public debate, it's often when we're already doing a topic, and we try, and obviously we can't ignore things, but we do have our formal mechanisms for people to input. So we can, people can use the public consultation to get in touch with us. Some patient organizations do organize big group responses. Sometimes they do petitions, and they would then send them to NICE because the patient organization is our stakeholder. But in general, we are set up so that we are independent from the ministry in England, from the Department of Health, and it's the department that tells us, that gives the sign off for which topics we do. So the pressure to look at a topic, for example, should go to the ministry in lots of countries, but we are independent of them. So to some extent, we don't listen to the media and we don't listen to the public outcries, because we know what we want to do and we know how to do it, and we're doing it as hopefully the best we can, involving the right people already.
That's very interesting, and I think that seems to make really a lot of sense. There was one additional question. There is a decision then made by the HTA body, but knowledge grows, and you talked about an appeal mechanism. Is that the way to go if new knowledge arrives that could impact the decision that has been made, or would that be a new assessment? Is there a minimum amount of time that would have to pass between one decision and taking up the topic again?
Okay, so we always review our decisions. That's one of NICE's core principles. And the standard time for medicines is 2 years after our first decision. But we have a team who look for important new information, and if something is found, or if something is notified to NICE that is of big importance and might change that decision, it can trigger an early review. So we have a process where we assess whether the new thing is quite interesting, and we'll put it on file, or very interesting and very important, and then that would trigger a quick review. But if not, after normally, as I say, 2 years, we would do a comprehensive search of all the appropriate evidence and ask all the relevant stakeholders, so that includes the patient organizations, whether or not they think we need to review the decision now, or whether we should wait a bit of time, and then at the point at which it's the best point to review that decision because we have enough new information to make it worthwhile, then we will review it and make sure that it's still up to date.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lizzie. That is very helpful. Amy, would you like to comment on some of the points, how NICE is doing it in comparison to what the guidance is recommending? Have there been conflicts so far, or let's say differences of opinion or recommendations in what Lizzie described, what real life in NICE is, and what the guidance is recommending?
Sure. I think it's quite important for anyone looking at this guidance to realize that when you're reading the suggested activities and when you're looking at the resources listed at the end, quite a lot of it actually comes from NICE, and that's been made very clear through clear citation referencing. But it's just a fact of life that NICE is one of the better established and mature HTA bodies in Europe when it comes to involving patients. So on the one hand, the resources that we've used in this guidance come from things like the HTA consensus building exercise. So that's a real look at the fundamental, excuse me, the fundamental values that patients and other stakeholders feel are important. But on the other hand, we wanted to say, and here are some practical ideas for how those values can actually be translated into real life. And as I say, it's just a fact of life that a lot of those ideas, not all of them, but a lot of them necessarily have actually come from NICE, because they've made a lot of progress in this area. Having said all that, I know that my organisation and other organisations are constantly in discussion with NICE about how to improve things further. And also just to note that although the public consultation for the guidance finished in summer 2016, the main bulk of the text was completed obviously sometime before that, and things change. So there may be things that NICE, for example, is doing now which are different, or that build upon the things that are suggested in the document. I'm afraid I don't have the detail to hand to be able to pick out specific examples. That's just like more of a health warning.
Okay, now that's fine. One comment was that it seems to be really important that patient organizations get a certain type of training, and you mentioned that also in your in the guideline, that training of patient organizations and patients is really an important element here in the process, because first of all, this is a very, very important type of advice, important to the patients themselves, who try to get heard and to express their needs in a gremium, in a committee that is making decisions about the access to the treatment. So that can also be very emotional. I think it's also an issue of finding out about the representativeness. When you gave the example at the beginning of the home dialysis situation, how representative is that this recommendation that patients would prefer to have have more easily access to this service in the hospital instead of revising their home, so to say, into a hospital bed. That is one thing. The other thing is really how much knowledge does it require for patients to be able to give a meaningful advice? How much knowledge about the process, the HTA process, but also how much knowledge about the disease and living with the disease and what the community is thinking. So the training of patients seems to be particularly relevant, and that's perhaps a question to you, Dominic. In how far can, for example, the EUPATI training and training approach help to increase the capacity of patients and patient organizations who are more knowledgeable about that process?
I completely agree with you, Ingrid, that patients and patient organizations need to be trained to take part in HTA, but I also feel, and I think things like sort of an HTA EUPATI, or even having done the EUPATI, you already have so much more knowledge on the whole process of getting the knowledge that will go into the HTA. I think that's really helpful, and one of the things I found in following the new developments and following new ways of looking at it, that most people also start saying not just the patients need to be trained, but also the HTA professionals and the HTA organizations need some training in how to involve the patients in the right way, how to create the open discussions, and how to be open-minded about what patients are bringing to the process, so that it can be, how shall I say, taken into the whole HTA in the way it was intended.
It's Lizzie. I would completely echo that. I think there's been a lot of focus on us, the agencies, training them, the patients, and it's seen that way. But I think it does need to be two ways. And I think the better that the agencies can be at explaining their processes, at having support materials and fact sheets, the better. But also, just as Dominique says, having the culture and the understanding of why it's important and why it's so important that we as agencies need this involvement and want this involvement, and it's a valid and useful and important part of the evidence, of the inputs, of the participation, then that is also really fundamental. So it's not a tick box, it's not tokenistic, it's not an add-on after all the science has been talked about, but it really is a fully integrated part of doing HTA. And that's why these international collaborations and the training resources, so we get people who are starting HTA processes and systems in developing countries, in parts of Europe that are just starting HTA, and we get it in there from the beginning.
Yeah, in Holland, for example, Dominic, it seems that patient involvement is not by definition a granted element. Is there any activity to on the patient side to change that? Can you give us perhaps some experiences on what has been tried to change that situation?
I find that quite hard to answer because it is different for different disease areas. We do see that, by example, in rare diseases, the HTA organizations overall and also in the Netherlands are more tending to include patients. In less rare diseases, it is quite difficult, but it's also quite difficult to get the discussion going because most of us are organized by disease areas and not so much working together in how can we all as patients organizations go and talk to the HTA organization, the reimbursement decision organization to change the system. So it sort of goes in leaps and bounds. And going back, if I may, Ingrid, to the previous questions, one of the things I noticed on page 4 on our guidance, that it says that you should have an exit questionnaire for the patients involved, but I think, and that has to do with the capacity building on both sides, and if you can put us on in the working together between the patients and the HTA professionals, is that there should be exit questionnaires on the process for both groups, and that we should learn from each process in how to improve it for the next one.
Yeah, I think that is a very important point. Such a development is not happening overnight. I think it starts probably also in the different countries with a pilot situation. I think that the breakthrough when a country starts or is in an early phase of this process is probably to make the body that is making the decision on the different reimbursements, etc., that this body becomes aware of the willingness and interest of patients and the possibility and also experiences from other countries that patient involvement is a positive thing, but I think that needs to be then very concretely showing what the advantages could be, how that can positively impact the outcome. And so I think collecting that experience that more developed HTA organizations and involved patient organizations are making, and to publish that broadly also to other patient organizations especially, and to other HTA organizations, is extremely important. And therefore such an outcome questionnaire, so to say, for both parts, and also the willingness to publish the results of that collaboration, also, let's say, details about how much impact did the patient involvement really have? Were the patient's recommendations and requests heard? In how far impacted that the overall decision, or where did the HTA organization have to say, no, sorry, there are other interests that we have to balance and where we cannot listen to the patient's advice. I think this type of experience needs to be much more broadly distributed also into other countries. It's probably happening to some degree on a national level, and probably even in local language. But not so much on an international level for organizations and patient organizations in other countries.
Yes, I completely agree, Ingrid, and I know that even I know from some experiences in other countries that even if the reimbursement or the introduction of a new drug in a country is blocked, by having patients involved in the whole process and having their arguments and their views incorporated in the HTA process, you have a much easier discussion afterwards because you have a better story.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that is also a very important aspect, because the decision has to be defended and has to be accepted by the patient community as an acceptable compromise. I would like to lead a bit to the next part that Amy is going to present. One distinction that has been made in the involvement, in the way how patients are involved, was the description from you, Lizzie, when you said we have on one hand patients who are asked to present their view on one particular disease, one particular drug, one particular occasion, but there are also other situations where there are permanent patient members in a particular stage of this process. Did I understand that correctly? That these lay members are partly patient representatives that are on a permanent involvement basis?
So the lay members are permanent members of the committees that make the decision for NICE on each medicine. But the lay members are not there to represent any one group of patients. They're there to represent patients and the publics as a viewpoint, as a way of looking at evidence. So we have different sorts of doctors on the committee, but again, they're not there to bring their specialism. They're there to make sure that patients, as well as doctors, as well as statisticians, as well as all sorts of people, look at the evidence together with their different ways of looking at the same piece of evidence, so that everyone comes together to make a decision that works for everyone. So the lay members are generalists and not there for any one disease area or any patient group, and that's why we involve the relevant stakeholders, the patient groups, throughout the process for the relevant topic. For each topic, we have the relevant patient organizations and the individuals who come.
So Amy, wouldn't that be a typical position for a patient expert, a EUPATI fellow, or somebody who has gained a lot of experience about being a patient, the patient community, the patient needs, and the medicines development and drug and medical device development process?
Sorry, is the question the typical position would be inputting to a specific medicine assessment?
Well,
being a permanent member.
I asked a bit asked at some stage the question why there is not a particular recommendation for a particular type of task or opportunity in the HTA process for different type of patients according to the EUPATI definitions. But this permanent lay member position, wouldn't that be a typical position for an educated and experienced patient like a EUPATI fellow, having the broad overview, the broad understanding of the medicines development process?
Yeah, and I mean, this is just my personal opinion. I'm not an HTA expert, and I don't work from within my organisation at the moment. I don't work on patient involvement in HTA, so that's just a little disclaimer. But my personal opinion is that a EUPATI fellow would be very well placed to sit in that position, because they have the broader outlook on what goes into medicine's development. And so I think they're less likely to see themselves as representing a particular condition or a particular group of patients. I mean, that's something I would certainly support. But as I say, that's my personal opinion.
Okay, I think this is very nicely going in line with the recommendations in the 3 other EUPATI guidances, where attempts have been made to identify those, let's say, positions or those functions that that highly experienced patient representatives can particularly well fulfill based on the learning that they have gone through, based on the experience that they have gone through, and having the broader picture. So I think I would like to ask you, also looking at the clock here, Amy, to continue in your presentation on the guidance, because I think we have now reached the passages which are dealing with the conditions of patients' involvement.
Yes, so there's not very much more to say. You'll be glad to know, because I'm very aware of the time. So I'm now on page 5, and the 2 diagrams there, there's one with circles and then one underneath. They basically just summarize the text, the suggested activities that are on the previous page, page 4. So that's all they do. So the circle diagram is looking at suggested activities in general, overall for running HTA, and then the one underneath looks at the different steps of HTA and where patients and how patients could get involved. So that just summarises what we said already. Then there are 2 quite important points to finish on, I think. One is the issue of compensation. It's quite often the case that all the people sitting around the table at an HTA assessment or committee meeting will be recompensed by their employer. They may be employed by the HTA body or by other organisations, academics and so on. And sometimes the only person or people who are not recompensed at all are the patients who are attending. And in some places this is changing, and that's something that the HTA exercise, and certainly my view coming from a patient group, that's something that we would like to see change, because that is a barrier to involvement. And obviously, even where we're talking about someone who is paid by a patient organisation, it would be useful to make sure that any out-of-pocket costs that the organisation has are reimbursed as well. And just to raise the issue again specifically of rare diseases by their very nature affect very few people, and a lot of the patient organisations representing rare diseases are voluntary run. They're run by families who have personal experience of the condition. So actually sometimes when you're talking about patient organisations, you're not talking about an organisation really with any resource to fall back on. So I think that's a very important point to bear in mind. And related to that, obviously, any payments need to be agreed upfront, and they need to be transparent and declared.
Yeah.
That leads in, sorry, Ingrid.
No, go ahead, sorry.
That leads into just the final point. And I think this text is the same across all of the guidances, which is the importance of having a written agreement. So for both parties, the patient organisation and the HTA body, a good written agreement will provide clarity so everyone understands what's expected of them, and it will provide protection in terms of knowing not only what's expected of you, but also whether you're going to get compensation and what that compensation is. And it gives an opportunity for, on the patient side, to declare any potential conflicts of interest. So they have the protection of having made that declaration. And I think I'd also like to just raise the flag again for the use of what we say in the UK, we use the phrase plain English. I don't know how that translates to other languages, but language that is appropriate and isn't technical and filled with jargon is particularly important in that written agreement.
Yeah.
So just to find, do you want me to finish off? Because there's just the resource table to mention.
Yeah, please.
So the Appendix 1 at the end is a list of all the resources that we used in pulling together the text for the document. And it also includes the templates and other tools that are out there at the moment that patient groups and patients and HTA bodies can use for smoothing patient involvement in HTA. The final appendix is just a list of abbreviations, and then the full reference list is also given for information at the end. And if anyone has, when they have a chance to sit down and look at it more carefully, if they have any queries about it, I think, is there a general inquiry email for EUPATI, but also I'd be very happy to receive any queries direct by email.
Okay, that's very good, Amy. There was one comment here where somebody tried one document and couldn't open it. So I think we in EUPATI, when we have to check on our website that all the links are working. And of course, links are changing, or addresses are changing. So I think it is an important task for EUPATI and our EUPATI office to regularly check the links that we have on the website to make sure that each one is working.
That's a good point. Thanks, Ingrid.
So we have a very international audience today. One question was, can patients from patient representative organizations from developing countries like Zambia, where I live, be nominated to participate in your consultative program? So Lizzie, are you approaching purely English patients, or is there also opportunity for people from other countries to participate?
To be a stakeholder, a patient organisation has to be working at a national level in England. They can be wider than that as well, but they have to have a presence in England, I'm afraid, because NICE needs to make decisions based on the experiences of patients and doctors and other people in England to do with English health services, to make sure that the decision that we make is appropriate for the English system. So we welcome views on the public consultation if people really want to let us know something, but they're not formal stakeholders, I'm afraid.
Okay, and another question to you, Dominic, from your ISPOR experience. Is there any database or any compilation of information about training opportunities in HTA processes on a more global or pan-European basis?
I would not be able to answer that. I do know there is a new development in Europe, and ISPOR also works in other regions of the world. So there are in their conferences, but there's also information on the website on HTA and what it requires, and they have, each conference has training opportunities. So I think it's spreading quite wide, and both in many continents or countries or agglomerations of countries, there is now cooperation in setting a sort of what do we feel should be our HTA set standard overall, and what should the HTA process in the least be, and then add options and add local information, patient information. So there is, the field is changing, but it is a bit hard to judge exactly what's happening where.
Yeah, I think that is a very important point that you made here, and I would like to take this also up because we need to wrap up here also. We are coming to 18:30. I think in comparison with the discussions about industry engagement or engagement of patients in medicines research and development with ethics committees and regulatory authorities, I think the variety of issues, topics, needs, systems in the area of HTA is even bigger. And also, therefore, the need to get into any type of more systematic approach for helping patients to find their way into their local, national, regional environment is really an important task, and there seems to be quite a high need. I have a number of questions which we could not tackle now, which go into this direction. So I think we have really to find out ways how we can increase the capacity of patients who get familiar with that topic, who find their way into the local environment of HTA assessments, and can make sure that they find an opportunity to talk with the respective agencies or organizations and find their way into reaching acceptance of their involvement also from a scientific point of view, because I think one of the hurdles is also that patient involvement here is often seen as lobbying, which is certainly one element of it, but it should not only be, because patients can also really contribute to this discussion from a more higher level scientific and more general point of view, and that needs to be communicated and also lived in that collaboration of the different stakeholders in that process. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. I hope you found it interesting. You will receive a questionnaire, a survey, in the next couple of days, where we ask you which other topics you would find interesting in being covered by a EUPATI webinar. We are looking for topics for the second half of the year. So please have a look at this survey and give us your ideas, your wishes, which topics you would like to have discussed here. They can be very, very different. Everything that touches patient engagement, patient involvement in the medicines development process. I would like to thank very, very much our presenter, Amy, and also the two panelists for your, Lissy and Dominic, for your very open and understandable and well-expressed comments and answers to the different questions. I hope that you also could take some interesting food for thought with you, and that you also enjoyed this webinar. I definitely did it. Thank you very much for your attendance and your contributions, and have a lovely summer evening. At least here in Brussels, it's beautiful tonight. Thank you. Bye-bye.